For being one of the most interesting characters in all of Pixar, Nick from Zootopia sure wasn't given a lot of background aside from his traumatic childhood experience. But when you rewatch Zootopia and pay attention to how the sly fox acts and a few of the things he says, it's clear to see that his childhood was anything but simple. A lot of that might have had to do with his parents and, according to one theory, specifically that they themselves faced a traumatic experience. In fact, it seems like there's a possibility that Nick's family was killed by predators and he was left as an orphan and forced to fend for himself as he grew up. The theory itself is actually pretty simple, and despite it being something that's highly debated among fans, there's no denying that the evidence is there. Throughout the entire movie Zootopia, the only time that Nick ever really brings up anyone in his family is when he was explaining to Judy what happened to him when he tried to join the Junior Ranger Scouts. During that flashback, he mentioned that he came from a poor household, but his mother scraped together all of the money that she could to get him a uniform. Beyond that singular mention of his mom, though, there was never any more mention of the Wild family, and some fans believe that it's because something truly terrible happened to them that left Nick as the lone surviving member of his family. You see, according to this theory, Nick's family was killed and possibly even eaten by predators, which not only forced Nick to live an even more troubled life as he learned to fend for himself on the streets, but it also led the fox to distrust anyone that belonged to a predator species. And before you go brushing the theory off as something that might be considered too dark for Pixar, the movie itself contained a lot of little details that support the idea. That being said, at the end of the day, these theories are all subjective, and it's up to you to decide whether or not you choose to believe them. Now, the first idea that supports the theory that Nick lost his family to a group of predators is simply the fact that the conniving fox seemed to go out of his way to avoid interacting with any predator species. Think about it. Not only was he shown to be well aware of the strength of the predators, like the mafia polar bears or the pack of security wolves, but he also seemed to know their mannerisms, which implies he studied their species. And as the old saying goes, know thy enemy and know thyself. In 100 battles, you will never be defeated. Meaning that if Nick's family was killed by predators, he likely would have learned as much as he could about them to keep himself out of harm's way. Now, in case you needed a brief reminder, since it might have been a while since you last saw the movie, in Zootopia, Nick knew enough about the Arctic Mafia to fear the polar bears, who were shown to be fiercely loyal to their leader, the Arctic shrew, Mr. Big. On top of that, he also knew that the wolves used howling to communicate with each other, and that once a wolf heard a howl, they wouldn't be able to stop themselves from getting involved. Lastly, he was impressed with Officer Hops when she used that to her advantage. In fact, that created one of the funniest scenes in the movie when Nick and Judy started to howl to sneak into the asylum that the wolves were guarding. All throughout the movie, Nick was shown to be cautious of the predators that they encountered, and this could easily be because his family was killed by predators when he was younger. At least that's how the theory sees it. On top of that, it should also be pointed out that Nick never really spent much time with the predators. That's how Zootopia made it seem, at least. When Officer Hops first started tailing Nick, you'll notice that all of his scams involved him dealing with prey. He would purchase the large ice pops from the elephants, who aren't considered predators in the animal kingdom. Then he would melt them down and sell smaller popsicles to the little business lemmings. And after that, he would take the mini popsicle sticks that were stained red and sell them as redwood to more small rodents. You'll notice throughout that entire transaction, Nick didn't deal with a single predator. This was likely because he chose to stay as far away from the sort of animals that, according to this theory, killed his family. Even if you look at the context that he took Officer Hops to when they first started working on their case together in Zootopia, they were all animals that would be considered prey, including Flash, the three-toed sloth that worked at the DMV while also being an incredibly reckless driver. All in all, the only actual predator that Nick ever deliberately spent time with was Finnick, his tiny con man partner. It seemed like the fox did everything he could to keep himself away from predators, and if this theory is accurate, it's likely because predators were responsible for killing his family. One of Nick's main characteristics in Zootopia was how cunning he was, and if this theory is true, that's likely because he grew up alone and was forced to learn all of the survival skills that he could learn. In the movie, Nick explained that if the world around him would only view him as a thieving fox that was constantly scheming, then there was no reason to be anything other than that. This was an ideal of Nick's that he revealed when he and Judy were on the gondola and the fox decided to finally open up a bit. It was a really heartbreaking story, and in case you don't remember it, it's the event in his life that Nick believed shaped him into who he really was. In the scene, Nick explained that all he ever wanted as a kid was to join the Junior Ranger Scouts, and despite him coming from a very poor family, his loving mother managed to buy him a uniform so that he could fit in. It was something that Nick had his heart set on, even if he was the only predator in his entire troop. Sadly, his peers didn't see it that way, and instead they welcomed him with falsely opened arms. When Nick arrived to join the group, he was told to recite the oath, which he began to do before all of the other children attacked him. This scene was made to be even more heartbreaking as the young fox cried out, wondering what he had done wrong, when in reality he was being judged for his species and not who he was as an individual. The animals who were supposed to be what would be considered prey in the real world showed more cruelty than most of the other characters in the entire movie, and they even forced the young fox to wear a muzzle, which is clearly something that traumatized him. Nick even claimed that his experience with the Junior Ranger Scouts is what molded the ideas that he lived by in the movie. According to this theory, though, that was only one of the hardships that Nick endured as he was growing up. If it's accurate, then it would have been shortly after he was muzzled that Nick's entire family was possibly killed by predators. And though the fox was surely influenced by the way he was treated and muzzled by his peers as Nick tried to join the Ranger Scouts, his level of street smarts combined with genuine intelligence was likely developed following the alleged tragedy. Think about it. When someone is forced into a dire situation at a young age, it typically shapes them and changes them for the rest of their life. This would apply to Nick, who, if this theory is true, would have lost his entire family and was left with nothing. That would force the young fox out on the streets, where he learned firsthand how hard the real world was. In that sense, Nick had two choices. He could either do everything he could to survive, which meant becoming the sort of fox that the world already viewed him as, or he could just give up. As the movie showed, though, Nick was strong, and although he may have strayed down the path of crime for some time, he ultimately did what he had to do for his own survival. This is something that he might not have been forced to do had his family been around to watch after him. Sadly, if this theory is true, then he wouldn't have had his family around to guide him because they died a tragic death at the hands of predators. Unfortunately, whether or not this theory is true seems to have been slightly disproven by the director of Zootopia, Rich Moore. On Twitter, he pointed out that Nick's mom is actually still alive and that she even lives in the apartment that Nick grew up in. And in another tweet, he even mentioned that Nick most likely invited her to the police academy's graduation ceremony, even though it wasn't shown on screen. That being said, it still doesn't explain what happened to the rest of Nick's family. For instance, Nick's father was never mentioned, and while there's a good chance that his mom and dad simply separated, there's also a chance that there is something deeper there. The movie also never mentioned Nick's siblings, which he would surely have. According to the real-world biology, a female fox will give birth to a litter that typically consists of 4 or 5 pups on average, which means that Nick Wilde would certainly have other family members. So whether it's canonized or not, there will always be the possibility that some of Nick's family was killed by predators, which led Nick to not trusting any predator species growing up, despite the fact that as a fox, he himself was a predator. What do you think, though? Is there any truth to the idea that Nick's family was attacked or killed by predators, which led him to vastly distrust other predators in Zootopia? Make sure you let me know in the comments below.